At home, she's a terrible wife. She takes advantage of being a housewife and doesn't do anything. After marriage, the husband who rarely came home said this at a family gathering. The relatives sympathized with him and said, "What a terrible wife." Then the husband went on to say, "She's bad at cooking and the food is inedible. She's bad at housework in general and the house is dirty. I don't even want to go home." I had reached my limit at this point. He had treated people so poorly, yet he had the nerve to say something like that. I was angry and said to my husband, "What are you talking about? You don't even have a house." My husband and relatives were surprised that I had spoken up. "We canceled our lease on our house a week ago. Your things are in storage. You don't even come home, so it's no wonder you didn't know." "What? Cancelled?" My father-in-law told my bewildered husband. "What's going on?" After this, my husband would experience hell. My name is Emily. I'm 32 years old and married. My parents run a medium-sized factory. My father is the president, and my mother is in charge of organizing part-time workers at the factory. I'm an only child who was raised by my doting parents. I graduated from college and worked as an accountant for a major automaker. I'm shy and had little experience with romance when I turned 30. My parents were worried about me and introduced me to several potential partners through arranged dates, but I didn't find anyone who clicked with me. Just as I was thinking of giving up on arranged dates altogether, my father introduced me to someone he wanted me to meet. He was the son of an important business partner of my father's company. I couldn't ruin my father's reputation, so I reluctantly agreed to meet him. That's where I met Ken, who would later become my husband. Ken worked for another related company to inherit his father's company. He had a kind smile and was polite, which made me like him. It turned out that he felt the same way about me, and we exchanged contact information after our arranged date. We went on dates after that and got engaged 6 months later when Ken proposed to me. I happily accepted his proposal and went to both families to report our engagement. My parents were overjoyed by my marriage. "Emily, I'm glad. Ken, please make my daughter happy. With your father's company, we can work together for a long time." My parents seemed happy not only that I would be happy but also that we had a special bond with an important business partner. Thanks to Ken's company's dealings, my father's company seems to be doing well. Next, we went to visit Ken's parents. Their house was a mansion beyond my imagination. Smiling, my mother-in-law said, "I'm glad Ken and Emily are doing well. This child didn't get married until this age, so I was a little worried." My mother-in-law is apparently a city councilor. She seems kind, but her way of speaking is clear and she seems like a person with vitality. Then my father-in-law chimed in. "Yes, our family is a family business, so we value our bonds with our family and relatives. Emily will be one of them. I'll count on you for Ken from now on." My father-in-law was a person who seemed like a president with his dignity. I was nervous because of his rough demeanor. However, he agreed to our marriage and was happy about it. After that, Ken and I registered our marriage and had a wedding ceremony. The condition for getting married was to become a housewife. My job is pretty busy, so I want Emily to take care of the house. I nodded at his words. "Okay, I'll do my best to serve you." Ken's salary was pretty good, and we received a large amount of wedding gifts from both families, so I wasn't particularly dissatisfied with being a housewife. My friends teased me that it was enviable to be a housewife with such good fortune. Ken and I started living together, but Ken refused his parents' offer to buy them a condominium. He said he wanted to live in a rental that was affordable for both of them. I thought it might not be good to rely on his parents for everything, so I agreed with Ken's idea. When they were deciding on a place to live, Ken said, "I'm too busy to go around looking for a real estate agent. Find a place you like and sign the contract. Is that okay?" "Yeah, I'll move in there." So I went around the real estate agents by myself and decided on a new rental apartment to live in with Ken after the wedding. We moved there after the wedding ceremony. We expected to start our sweet newlywed life, but it was soon shattered. Ken didn't come home at all. He came home when it was already past midnight due to overtime work on weekdays and left early in the morning. He also worked on weekends and holidays and said he had to work overtime. He also went on business trips frequently and sometimes stayed overnight. I stayed at home all day doing housework during that time, but I had a lot of free time. At first, I made food for Ken, but he said he had eaten outside and went to bed without touching it every day. So he continued to sleep at home without doing anything else. I gradually began to feel empty about such days. Is this what marriage is like? I did decide to support Ken, but this isn't good. After thinking that way, 3 months after the wedding, I decided to talk to Ken. Hey, Ken, are you really that busy with work? We don't have any time as a couple. Then Ken answered with a tired expression while loosening his tie. Yeah, I'm busy with work. Can't you see that I'm tired? I understand that. Then don't say anything unnecessary. I'm working hard to earn our living expenses. When he said that, I couldn't say anything. Certainly, Ken gave me more than enough living expenses every month. Since he was supporting me, I couldn't complain about his work. At that time, Thanksgiving Day was approaching. So I asked Ken, don't we have any gatherings or anything during Thanksgiving Day? Don't we have to visit your parents' house? Then Ken replied, no, it's okay. Besides, I have work too, and my father goes on a trip every year. But are you sure it's okay? I'm saying it's okay. We also sent them gifts for the summer greeting season, so it's fine. Ken said that in an annoying tone and went straight to the bedroom. At that time too, I could only stare at his back without saying anything. Time passed, and around the time Thanksgiving was over, I received a phone call. Hello, is this Emily? It was my father-in-law. Yes, father-in-law. It's been a while. I can't believe you didn't show up at the family gathering for Thanksgiving. What? I told you that we value our bonds with family and relatives. You're married now, so you should show up and help out. I was criticized without any explanation, and my mind went blank. I didn't even know there was a gathering for Thanksgiving, and Ken had told his parents that they were going on a trip. I'm sorry, father-in-law, but I don't want to hear your excuses. I asked Ken, and he said you're not even doing housework properly. What? I was at home all day and did housework perfectly. Did Ken really tell his father that? You became a housewife, so you should take care of the house properly. Got it? My father-in-law said that in an overbearing manner, and I could only answer yes. That night, I told Ken exactly what my father-in-law had said to me. You said there wasn't a gathering for Thanksgiving. So why? Did I say that? Maybe you misheard me. That's not true. If I knew there was a gathering, I would have gone. And if you have any complaints about my housework, you should tell me before telling your father. I pleaded with him in tears, but Ken just laughed. You're just lazing around at home all day. What are you talking about? I'm trying my best to do housework perfectly while you're not here. I don't know. You're probably just playing around with my money. That's not true. Ken looked at me coldly and left immediately. After that, Ken's attitude became even colder. He stopped coming home altogether. When I contacted him, he only said he was working. It was strange that he didn't come home at all. Something was definitely wrong. Ken must be hiding something from me. So I decided to investigate Ken by using my savings from when I was single to hire a private investigator. The seasons passed, and before I knew it, New Year's Day was approaching. While I was doing housework, my father-in-law called again. Emily, there's a family gathering for New Year's Day, so make sure you show up. Yes, I understand. I immediately contacted Ken. Hey, father-in-law told me to show up for New Year's Day. Huh? You don't have to come. What? But I can't expose an incompetent wife like you to my relatives. I'll go alone, so don't come. The phone call ended abruptly. A few days later, I was in front of my in-laws' house. I could hear the sound of a lively party from inside. When I pressed the intercom, my surprised mother-in-law greeted me. "Emily, I heard you weren't coming." I bowed my head and showed up at the party. Then I heard these words from my relatives. "Finally, the bride shows up. Is that the wife who doesn't do any housework? It's been a while since we've seen her." My father-in-law looked sullen and glared at me. Ken, who was drinking with his relatives, was stunned when he saw me. He probably didn't expect me to show up here. However, he couldn't kick me out in front of his relatives. So he turned away from me and started drinking again. While my mother-in-law and I were preparing food and drinks in the kitchen, I overheard a conversation in the living room. "Ken, is your married life going well?" "As you can see, uncle. As we can see. She's a terrible wife who takes advantage of being a housewife and doesn't do anything." I could hear Ken's arrogant voice. The relatives sympathized with him and said, "What a terrible wife." Then Ken went on to say, "She's bad at cooking and the food is inedible. She's bad at housework in general and the house is dirty. I don't even want to go home." I had reached my limit at this point. He had treated people so poorly, yet he had the nerve to say something like that. I moved to the living room and said to Ken, "What are you talking about? You don't even have a house." I intervened in the conversation, and my husband and relatives looked surprised. "What? I don't even have a house." When Ken told me that in a panic, I calmly replied, "I canceled our lease on our house a week ago. Your things are in storage. You don't even come home, so it's no wonder you didn't know." Yes, I had canceled our lease on our house and started living alone. "What? Canceled?" Ken's eyes widened as his father told him. "What does that mean?" Ken still couldn't believe what was happening and couldn't say anything. So I turned to my father-in-law. "Ken has hardly come home since we got married. He hasn't even eaten my cooking once. He hasn't set foot in our home for months." Then my father-in-law raised his eyebrows. "What? Then where has Ken been sleeping? He seems to be living with his mistress. Right, Ken?" "What?" The relatives were murmuring. Ken blushed and said, "You're making things up. I just slept at the office. You're neglecting me because I'm busy, you worthless wife." Then my father-in-law said something like this. "Ken also said that, Emily. What are you thinking? Canceling the lease on the house without permission and making up lies about cheating." The relatives also said, "What a terrible wife. Poor Ken." Then I took an envelope out of my bag and dumped its contents on the spot. Inside were numerous photos of evidence of Ken's infidelity. Ken was smiling as he linked arms with a flashy woman and entered shady places and the woman's house. My father-in-law was staring at them intently. I told my husband firmly, "The evidence is there. Why don't you explain it to everyone yourself?" As Ken looked at the photos, his face turned pale. "That's not true." Then my mother-in-law, who had somehow appeared next to me, told him in a low voice, "Ken, tell us the truth." Ken seemed to give up and began to speak reluctantly. "I've been involved with her since before we got married. She's a woman I met at a nightclub. We love each other." The relatives were murmuring. Then I said, "That's why you didn't come home, because you were going to her house. So why did you marry me?" Father and mother would never approve of me marrying a woman from a nightclub. I thought I could reassure them by marrying a subcontractor's daughter. Despite my anger, I asked him another question. "Why did you badmouth me to your relatives and father-in-law?" "I thought it would make it easier to get divorced. I really wanted to be with her. I wanted to dump you from the beginning. But people wouldn't understand if there wasn't a reason." I was about to open my mouth in anger when there was a loud noise. My mother-in-law had slapped Ken in the face. "Mother, you're saying nothing but selfish things. What do you think marriage, Emily, is?" Then my father-in-law stood up and told him, "Ken, you're a shameful son. We're disowning you. What? Disowning? But I'm going to inherit your company, aren't I? We're not going to let that happen. Don't ever show your face in front of us again. Apologize to Emily too. Then Ken knelt down in front of me. Emily, I'm sorry. Please tell father and mother that you forgive me. I shouted at him loudly. I won't forgive you. We're getting divorced. We'll take plenty of compensation for damages. And good luck with your mistress, you scumbag. After that, Ken was kicked out by his father and relatives and left crying. On the other hand, I apologized many times to my in-laws and relatives. I got their promise that they would continue doing business with my family. Later, Ken and I divorced and I was able to win a large amount of compensation for damages. My in-laws gave me several $10,000 as compensation for causing trouble, so I decided to accept it. As for Ken, he was literally disowned by his parents and lost his future position as president. Moreover, he was hired by his father-in-law through connections. He lied so he could spend time with his mistress even though he couldn't do his job well. He was repeatedly late or absent from work, so he was fired. Ken lost both his future and income at once. He was even dumped by his mistress. Now he lives alone in a shabby apartment and is desperately looking for work. Even after hearing that, I have no sympathy for him. Rather, I feel like he got what he deserved. As for me, I returned to work while living alone. Thanks to various compensation for damages, I won't have any trouble living for a while. Next time, I plan to go overseas for a change of pace. From now on, I want to live brightly while valuing myself. I visited the house, but I would throw away everything that belonged to Grandma, so it's okay. Don't worry about it. My son's wife said. She wasn't the only one who was troublesome. Get out. This shabby accident property is more than enough for free. This is the house where Grandma passed away, isn't it? This is an unlucky house that will only become a debt. Even her parents shout together. But that house. When I tried to say that. Okay. Okay. Please leave quickly. She was locked out with a sneer. I'm Camilla, 54 years old. My husband is David, 56 years old. My son Luke is in his second year of marriage. My son's wife is Ellie. She used to work for the same company as my son and retired when they got married. Luke has a transfer every 3 to 4 years due to work. I want to go with him, so it's difficult to decide when to quit, so I don't work. After getting married, Ellie became a housewife. The two of them rented an apartment relatively close to our house and lived there. A very smooth married life. Until then. Transfer has been decided. Luke called me. So? I thought it was about time. Where? It's a pretty far place. The land he mentioned was a distance that could be reached by Amtrak. So? When are you moving? You should check out supermarkets and stuff when you get there, and you should move with plenty of time for Ellie. So I gave Ellie some advice. Then? No, that's not it. Luke hesitated for a moment. And he continued with the next words. I'm going to be transferred alone. What? I expected a transfer, but being transferred alone was too unexpected. It's different from what we talked about before we got married. But Luke said something even more unexpected. Hey. The house where Grandma who is hospitalized now lived. It's empty now, right? So? She said she wants to live there or something. What? What do you mean? My mother who is hospitalized does have a house where she lives alone. But she hasn't passed away yet, and we haven't even thought about what to do after that time comes. It doesn't make sense for my son's wife to use it as her residence without permission. And on top of that, she wants to live there. It's too incomprehensible. I'll take the phone. Please. I thought I'd talk to her firsthand. Hello, this is Ellie. She answered the phone smoothly. And before I could ask her anything, she started talking. People will eventually end their lives. So when do you think she'll pass away? What? That's not good luck at all. And it's too insensitive. So I want to move there within a month after her death. Wait a minute. Can we talk about Luke's imminent transfer first? You said at the time of your marriage that you wouldn't work so you could go wherever you wanted whenever he moved. I thought you were ready to go with him on his transfer. Then? Well, that's true. But the story has changed, hasn't it? I didn't know there was an empty house before we got married. If we have a house, I won't have to work anymore, right? And if we live with my father and mother, we won't have to pay for nursing care in the future. What? Huh? What did you just say? Are you going to live with your parents? I threw questions at her in rapid succession. I didn't understand what she meant. Am I talking to an alien family? Are they going to use my mother's house as a base for conquering Earth? Wait. Can I talk to Luke? I think it will be a waste even if you talk. Bye. The phone was hung up. I couldn't talk with Luke. Of course, I immediately called Luke's smartphone. But he didn't answer the phone. I called him back many times, but he didn't answer. Was his wife telling him something right now? I told my husband what happened while my face turned pale. What? Naturally, my husband was also shocked. No. No. Wait a minute. Your mother was already hospitalized at Luke's wedding, and Ellie has never met her. So, why do you have to donate the house to her in-laws? My husband had almost the same reaction as me. You think so too? I thought for a moment that my values were strange because she said it so naturally. But as we talked, we gradually calmed down. Well, of course, that kind of talk won't work. If you refuse, it'll be okay. That's right. If I don't give her the key, and if I don't give permission for inheritance, which will probably happen, it'll be okay. But the Space family hadn't given up on their ambition to conquer Earth. Then Luke went on a business trip alone, and 6 months passed. According to Luke, his wife wouldn't move no matter what happened, and the moving date came. Of course, she stayed alone in the neighborhood during that time and didn't contact me at all. And then, my mother passed away. She had received a life expectancy notice and had been hospitalized for a long time, so I was naturally prepared. However, the funeral was tough. It's often said that when you're in this situation, you only remember good things, but my mother was really warm-hearted. So even though I held such feelings, tears flowed when we said our final goodbyes. After finishing the funeral and seeing off our relatives who had come to visit us, Luke's family was the last to leave. However, at that very last moment when they were leaving. Well then, mother-in-law. I've been saying this for a while now, but can I have the key? She said it in such a natural tone as if it were obvious. What? It wasn't a story to ask in this situation. I couldn't believe my ears. Oh. Never mind. I'll get it myself. Huh? She didn't even wait for me to recover from my confusion. I saw it there on the day of our wedding greeting. She walked into the living room without permission and opened one of the small drawers in the corner. Then she took out a key with a plate that read Mother's House. I think it took less than 3 minutes for her to do all of these actions. Each action, opening a drawer without permission, taking it away as if it were obvious. Today was a funeral. Everything was unreasonable. Wait a minute. I couldn't help but raise my voice in protest. But Ellie ignored such voices and went back to the entrance as if nothing had happened. Luke. When I realized that my voice wouldn't reach her, I called out to Luke instead. Stop that wife of yours. My son. My son, who had been stunned, finally came back to his senses. Wait a minute. Luke rushed to the entrance in a hurry and scolded his wife. Then, go back to your business trip quickly? This is our story living in Chicago. Outsiders should keep quiet. She said something like that. Outsiders? That house is. You won't make it to your reserved Amtrak if you don't hurry up and take a taxi soon? Call a taxi quickly. Then she opened the door and left. The door closed. Luke stood still. I sat down exhaustedly. Never come again. My husband trembled with anger. Luke had work to do and had already reserved an Amtrak ticket, so he went back home on that day. 2 weeks later, I called my daughter-in-law frequently and even visited her as a last resort without contacting her. However, she didn't answer the phone, and even though she was clearly at home, she didn't answer the doorbell. I called from in front of her room. She came out only once. I looked around the house, but I would throw away everything that belonged to Grandma, so it's okay. Don't worry about it. When will she come to the empty house? I didn't even know about it, so I went to the empty house every day. Then one day, I saw a moving company entering the house. My husband and I rushed over. This house. I tried to protest to the 3 people who came out of the house. However, I was shouted at by my daughter-in-law's father. Get out. This shabby accident property is more than enough for free. Daughter-in-law's mother also said, this is the house where Grandma passed away, isn't it? This is an unlucky house that will only become a debt. It was hopeless. When I tried to say, but that house, I was pushed out of the gate by my daughter-in-law's father with his shoulder and told to leave quickly. After that, no matter how much I rang the doorbell or what I did, there was no response. When I was about to leave, my eyes fell on a garbage bag. It contained a photo of my late father that my mother had decorated. Together with garbage. I took out the photo from the garbage bag. I'm sorry, Dad. I'll take you home. I'll clean you up. As tears flowed down my cheeks, I swore that this would definitely bring divine punishment and that I would never forgive them. At this point, it's not about rights to the house anymore. The Space family should go back to space. 1 month later, Luke returned from his business trip alone. He came back temporarily using the weekend. Apparently, he had finally taken a break from his relatively intense work. Let's go talk together, Luke suggested. The 3 of us went out together. There we saw a completely different appearance of my daughter-in-law, her father, and her mother who had driven me out when we met before. All 3 of them looked haggard and had sunken eyes. I can't sleep, my daughter-in-law said with dark circles under her eyes. I hear noises like snap or rustle. I laughed softly. As expected. You said accident property yourself. If you throw away photos like that, well, you know. When you took over this house and I went to persuade you later and tried to say, but that house, you shut me out without listening and said okay. Please leave. This house is a house that my mother gave me saying, please take care of your father. What? It's their fault for not even listening to their wills. I explained it. Before his death, my father treasured my mother and me very much. He loved spending time with his family. So, to make sure he wouldn't be lonely after his death, my mother would offer wine that he liked twice a day and talk to him. I did it for her when she was absent. But it's strange, isn't it? Maybe it's because of my father's personality that watched over us before he passed away. There were various things like if we did home gardening, we could harvest crops, the rabbit we kept lived a long time, and my mother could pass away peacefully without much suffering. But this time is different, isn't it? Of course, he would be angry if he was suddenly thrown out. What? As my daughter-in-law was about to say something like, there's no such thing as a curse, there was another snappy sound somewhere in the house. The 3 of them huddled together. It's not just the sound, there's a leak, and sometimes something crumbles with a rustling sound. It's too dangerous to sleep at night. Well, that must have really angered my father. I said leisurely. If it's such a haunted house, you should have told us. That's not something you should say after occupying it without permission. All 3 of them seemed unable to retort. Well, it's time to leave, my husband declared. What? Don't decide to leave on your own. When my daughter-in-law shouted, her mother joined in. My husband and I have always been renting. We were planning to move into a barrier-free apartment eventually. My husband replied nonchalantly. Then you should look elsewhere with the money for that barrier-free apartment. However, her mother said, we used all the money because our daughter brought up this house. We were really deceived. This thought process of occupying the house and pretending to be a victim. This has become a case where we must crush both the parent and child. Then my husband said, but do you know that you messed up the interior of this house by yourselves? What? It was an unexpected point that they hadn't anticipated. The three of them exclaimed in surprise in unison. But after a momentary pause, Ellie regained her sanity and shouted. What? The photo? I threw away the photo. No. You guys knocked down the living room and the adjacent room. You called it remodeling. But isn't it better for the living room to be spacious? My daughter-in-law retorted. Rather than having many old rooms, it's better for 3 people to live together. Her father also joined in. 3 people? It's not 4. It's amazing that my son wasn't included at this point. My husband laughed and said, ha, ha, ha. The 3 of them looked at him with puzzled faces. My husband pointed to a certain place. You cut down the pillar. Oh. When he said that, I noticed where he was pointing. There was certainly a large pillar when I entered and exited. My husband began to speak. The construction company that entered this remodeling was an acquaintance of mine. It was Mr. Wilson. I also remembered the name of the person he was talking about. Actually, my husband's job is an exterior wall painter. He often gets work from Wilson Construction. The president of Wilson Construction is a one-man contractor and my husband's classmate. You guys told Mr. Wilson to cut the pillar because you wanted to remodel it here. When Mr. Wilson tried to say, but that pillar, he heard a condescending remark from you guys saying, yes, yes, just listen to what the customer says, this construction company. Mr. Wilson was troubled and consulted me, so I replied, please respond as they say. You guys didn't listen, and you didn't listen to your wife's argument this time either. You should pay for your own mistakes. What? It was clear from their expressions that the price was too high. This house is old as you guys say. It's a house built with one pillar supporting it. It has lost its main pillar and is now supported by walls. Even if it doesn't collapse all at once like in a comedy, various parts will come loose eventually. Leave before it collapses. Even if you say that, we have nowhere else to go. You have a big sin for knowing and leaving it alone. Fix it with your own money. Luke suddenly intervened in the noisy argument. There's no reason to help others. What? My daughter-in-law shouted in a frenzy. Did I do something? Of course. It's a splendid crime called real estate invasion. And you damaged property by throwing away photos without permission. What? She shouted again at the words that could be answered immediately. My son answered. Of course. You guys lived in someone else's house without permission. Wait a minute, isn't that strange? I'm your wife. My daughter-in-law clung to her son with a half-smile. But my son was cold. If this were my house, even if my spouse lived there without permission, it wouldn't be a crime. But this is in my mother's name that she inherited. If my mother sues, the police will move. My son continued. You called me an outsider even though I'm your family. If I weren't here, you wouldn't have any connection with this house in the first place. Even though it was a condition of our marriage for me to follow you on your business trip, you broke that too and lived in my mother's house without permission. But you don't seem to understand that. It's a difference in values. Divorce. This makes you outside. Leave by tomorrow. If you don't leave, I'll call the police. My daughter-in-law collapsed weakly. My son put green paper in front of her. Her father and mother were also stunned when they saw the green paper before hearing the words, call the police. In the end, as expected, my daughter-in-law and her parents left the empty house reluctantly. By the way, when a house makes a sound like a snap or a rustle, it's called a house ringing, which is a sound that occurs when wood swells or dries due to humidity and is not usually a supernatural phenomenon. After the divorce, my wife became an illegal resident and could no longer live in the neighborhood. My parents also spent all their money on overseas travel, so the three of us were wandering around. As for me, I put the photo I rescued that day at home and started praying with my mother's photo. Since then, I've felt like my houseplants are doing well and even my cactus has bloomed. Well, I don't know if it was a small blessing or just a coincidence, but I interpreted it as my mother and father watching over me, which was very much appreciated. In the end, that land became a parking lot. Now, due to its location near the station, there are many people coming and going. And then, a few years later, my son got remarried. This time, it seems that his new wife will accompany him on his transfer. It's tough to move around and rebuild relationships with people. But if I can offer souvenirs from various places, my ancestors can eat local sweets from different places and will be happy. As she offered wine to the photo, his new wife murmured, "We'll come again with the three of us next time." Huh? I immediately caught that little word and asked again. "Well, that's what I mean." She smiled. The gentle scent of roses next to the photo seemed to waft through the air at that moment.